welcome to the Marine Biological Association's podcast, The Marine Biologist. This podcast is the accompaniment to our magazine, also called The Marine Biologist, and it explores the current issues that face our ocean. If you'd like to find out more about the Marine Biological Association, or where you can get your hands on the Marine Biologist magazine, then please visit our website, www.mba.ac.uk. Enjoy the episode. Excellent. So hello and welcome to this episode of the Marine Biologist podcast. I'm Kathy. I'm one of your hosts. And in a moment, I'm going to hand over to Guy Baker, who is the editor of the Marine Biologist magazine. And I'm going to get Guy to let those of you that haven't joined us before know a little bit about what the idea is behind this podcast. So over to you, Guy.
Thanks, Kathy. The Marine Biologist podcast is simply a series of discussions with authors of articles from the magazine about the big issues affecting the ocean.
Excellent. So this episode is going to be about one of the articles from the latest edition of the Marine Biologist magazine, titled The Fall of Great Ocean Farmers. So I'm going to hand over to you, Guy, to introduce its authors and photographer, and also this week's guests.
Thanks, Kathy. Yeah, we're really delighted to have in this episode Matthew Savoca, who joins us from California. Matthew's a postdoctoral researcher at Hopkins Marine Station, Stanford University. And we're equally delighted to welcome Conor, who's a whale biologist and freelance researcher, and he's currently working for Lindblad and National Geographic. So Matthew and Conor, a very warm welcome. Thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much, Guy. I appreciate it.
Can we just have a little bit of an introduction from you both about a little bit about the work you do and how you got where you are?
Sure. I could kick it off if you'd like. So as you all mentioned, I'm a postdoctoral researcher in California, but I've always been really interested in nature and how it functions, and more recently, what human activity is doing to impact the functioning of nature, and ultimately what we might do to reverse those impacts. And I just became really fascinated with how we could essentially use animals to learn about the ocean, or animals could teach us is probably a better way to say. Animals could teach us things about the ocean, about the ocean's function, and about what we're doing and the impacts that humans are having on the ocean. And so in graduate school, I became interested in how animals find food and how their foraging behavior affects ocean ecology. And when you think about that, it's hard to not think about whales if you're thinking about large megafauna. And I think one of the things that's also really fascinating about whales, and perhaps we'll touch on this later, but is how little we know about them. And so I kind of became really passionate about the large whales, how little we know about them, and what we could do to learn more about their just basic biology, ecology, with efforts ultimately to try to conserve them. So that's a little bit of my background.
Thank you, Matthew. That's great. And Conor, can you give us a little bit of background?
Yeah, I'm a zoologist. I grew up in Cove in Ireland, on an island in near Cork in Ireland, and I was fortunate enough as a kid to see whales and dolphins from my house, and I was shocked that no one had answers about why they were there, what they were feeding on, where they were going next, and I had a very kind of questioning mind, I suppose, as a kid, and that kind of my interest was sparked just from things I saw from home. I did zoology as an undergrad in Cork in UCC, focusing on bottlenose dolphins, and then went on to do my PhD in the same area where I grew up in the Celtic Sea, and looked at fin and humpback whales and their feeding ecology. And I was very interested in answering those questions I had as a kid, actually. What were the whales feeding on? Why were they there? What was motivating them to come so close to shore? And later on, worked for marine conservation research on a vessel called Song of the Whale, using acoustics. And the irony being, I've got terrible hearing and hearing decline, but that didn't get in the way of me using acoustics to study whales. So that's my background in a nutshell.
Brilliant. Thank you both. Let's move on to talk about the article. The article, Fall of the Great Ocean Farmers. Matthew, what animals and region are you looking at in this article?
So I think we're looking at the most spectacular animals in the most spectacular region of the planet, but I'm biased. Conor, I was going to ask Conor what he thinks, but he might be biased too. So maybe this is the wrong group of guests. So we're looking at the largest animals to ever exist, primarily the blue and the fin whales, and not just the blue and the fin whales, but the blue and the fin whales in Antarctica. And the subspecies of blue and fin whales in Antarctica are the biggest of the blue and the fin whales. So, for example, we have blue whales off the coast of California. We work on them a lot here, actually. But our blue whales in California are about 20% smaller than an Antarctic blue whale. So, put another way, our blue whales in California are about the size of an Antarctic fin whale. And an Antarctic fin whale is the size of our blue whale, but an Antarctic blue whale is like no other animal on Earth. And, it became really interesting to me to think about these animals and the past state of this system. Because only 100 years ago, there were 300,000 more Antarctic blue whales than there are today. Probably more than that, actually, probably close to 350,000 more Antarctic blue whales. And to put that into context, the total population of blue whales on the entire planet today is about 30,000. So, I mean, just the scale of that is impossible for someone in the modern world to comprehend. But yeah, we're talking about blue and fin whales in the Southern Ocean, and particularly in the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean, so like south of South America and the Atlantic Ocean.
You say that there used to be so many and now there aren't. What happened?
Humans happened, like a lot of things on Earth. Unfortunately, humans have a knack, as of course I don't have to explain to you all or anyone probably listening. We have a knack for identifying resources, figuring out ways to extract those resources, and up until about 50 years ago, until the environmental revolution of the 1960s and 70s, doing so without really, without any careful study of what happens when you remove those animals and not just animals, trees, of course, to land conversion to agriculture. It's not just animals. And then there are numerous examples over the last couple hundred years, specifically over the last 100 years, to demonstrate that the ocean is not inexhaustible. But for a long time, we just thought there was nothing that we could do to touch the ocean's bounty.
Yeah, I mean, it's a incredible issue that it kind of we all benefit from the whaling that was carried out, and that's something I'm always quick to point out to people. It's so easy to kind of judge the folks of the past who did this. They were doing it in the context of recovering from world wars, and there were food security issues, and they were heroes of their day. I've spoken to whalers who are still alive who worked in South Georgia and Antarctic waters, and they're elderly now, but we're very proud of the work that they did. But equally, there's a sense of shame through when you speak to them about the ultimate effect that it had on the populations of whales. But yeah, they were recovering their country's economies, and these are all the economies that are still doing well today. We got a step up on the economic ladder. All of the whaling nations did, and our economic successes today are owed to the extraction of whales in the past.
Yeah, and I think there are two things just quickly that I wanted to build off of there, because I've spoken with audiences, even audiences that have marine science backgrounds, and they're surprised by two things when we talk about this modern whaling. Number one, and this is really cool, I've never spoken to a whaler that was back in the whaling days, but the point here is that this happened so recently that you could, in theory, talk to someone who was a part of industrial Antarctic whaling. All this was happening in the 20th century. We didn't kill a whale in the Southern Ocean until the 20th century. And then within the 20th century, the first 3/4 or so of the 20th century, we killed 1.5 or 2 million large whales in the Southern Ocean. So the scale and the pace of the killing there was unprecedented anywhere in the world's oceans as far as whales go. So it's very recent. That's number one. Number two is None of these whales, or very few of these whales that were killed, were used for lighting oils. That's the other common misconception, is that we use these whales and their components to light street lamps. But of course, in the mid 1900s, we had incandescent light bulbs, electricity, and so on. So we didn't need whales for lighting oil. Primarily, and this is, I think, what's quite tragic looking back on it, whales were used for mostly marginal products, things like margarine, car oil, industrial lubricants. The bones were mashed up and turned into animal feed, and so on. These are, of course, all still products that we have and use today, and we don't have whales in any of them. And so it's quite sad then to think back and to say, man, we did all this to the whales and to the Southern Ocean ecosystem for margarine. It's quite shocking and sad. But again, I don't necessarily blame the whalers themselves, but rather people for kind of our leap before you look mentality in terms of exploiting natural systems.
Can I just ask, what if, I understand that our listeners could be joining us from anywhere in the world, but for those of us who are in the Northern Hemisphere, what's so important about the Southern Ocean and the whales in the Southern Ocean?
It's a very distant place if you live in the Northern Hemisphere. In particular, it is like going back to the Ice Age. So you get a real sense of you're going into some past place. Of course, there's a misconception that it's like going to some place that's unaffected by humanity, which it's been totally altered by humanity. But there are no people living there, very few people living there, mostly biologists. What it means for us in the northern latitudes is it is the kind of oceanic heartbeat of the planet. It is the pump that pumps all the cold water around, and it's where the ocean conveyor system all starts. So anytime you talk about oceanography, you think about the North Atlantic Drift, the Gulf Stream, and keeping the northern latitudes milder. This is all thanks to the Southern Ocean and that halo of sea ice that forms and then contracts and expands and contracts each year between summer and winter. That trickle down of saline water, when the sea ice forms, you've got the salinity increases and rejects the salt from the sea ice. That trickles down. You've got the wind coming off the land because of the incredibly cold continent that it is. And those two effects basically kickstart all the ocean conveyor systems. So although it's very distant from us, we're very much dependent on business as usual is what we want from Antarctica. We wanted to keep pushing the ocean currents around in the way that we have adapted to, and we don't want that to change. And of course, that is changing.
The other thing that struck me when I was there is the scale of the ice is just impossible to imagine if you haven't been there. So, many folks, at least in America, might counter with, well, I've been to Alaska and I've seen glaciers in Alaska, and those are spectacular, of course, no question. But I mean, it is just a different world down there. It is a world that just walls of ice, hundreds of feet high, icebergs the size of cities, sometimes literally floating around, and just the colors and the lights and the shapes that the ice creates is really pretty spectacular. And then when you're there and you realize that this landscape that's created by ice is transient. Of course, that ice is going to move and it's going to melt. And so what's really, really amazing about it, I think, is any spectacular ice formations that, Conor saw this year, or I saw when I was down there a couple of years ago. No one else saw or is going to see those very same formations. It's not like, oh, go to this cliff in, I don't know, Dover or something like that. I'm trying to come up with a UK reference. And then we can all have the same shared experience of going to the cliffs of Dover or whatever. Because Antarctica is not like that. It's constantly changing. It's an incredibly dynamic environment. I could see some ice formation, and then you could go back even in a couple of months and certainly in a couple of years, and it would be totally different.
Matthew, you touched on some numbers just now, and the whole thing's got me thinking about the scale of ocean productivity. How do scientists estimate the population of blue and fin whales before whaling began?
Yeah, so when you say particularly blue and fin whales and these other whales, I'm thinking again primarily in the Southern Ocean, and that's where our focus will be unless otherwise stated. So I think one of the things that's kind of special, and I don't mean special in a good way, I just mean special in how we removed whales from ocean systems worldwide, is by the time we were getting to the Southern Ocean, our technology had already advanced to the point where we realized the value in taking careful data on the animals that we were removing. And so there's actually exceptionally rich information, scientific information about the whales that were removed from the Southern Ocean. So, and there's information on the length of animals, the sex of animals, the different components of the animals, if there were irregular. I mean, there's so much information in the whaling data. But in general, we believe the whaling nations were fairly honest about how many whales that were being killed. And so using those numbers, people who use math to understand ecological systems can plug those numbers into population models, and we can essentially back calculate how many whales there must have been with some measurement error, of course. So when I say there were 300-ish thousand blue whales in 1900 in the Southern Ocean, the best guess is a range between something like 300 and 350,000. And for fin whales, the best guess is something like 600,000, but the range might be between 500 and 700,000.
Yeah, and you talk about these whales being farmers. Can you tell us a little bit about those relationships and what you're referring to there?
Yeah, I think, so the idea of whales as farmers is an idea that came out of conversations with a guy, Victor Smetacek, who is an oceanographer. He's a German-Indian oceanographer, just a really smart guy who thinks about ecosystems holistically, which I think is quite uncommon for ecologists and scientists. I think ecologists and scientists tend to really zero in on the component of the ecosystem that they love and they study, and kind of with the exclusion of other things. But Victor is really impressive because his training is biological oceanography. So he thinks about how nutrients affect phytoplankton growth, and then how phytoplankton growth affects biogeochemical cycles. So how does this all link in with whales? So at some point in the maybe 15 years ago or so, he realized, along with another marine biologist who studies krill, and Stephen Nickel, he realized that the removal of whales coincided with declines in krill in the Southern Ocean and overall declines in productivity. And so they started to generate this idea about what happened when we removed the whales. Why did ecosystems become less productive when we removed whales? And this led to a number of subsequent studies that tested the nutrients or the potential for whale poop feces to actually fertilize ocean ecosystems. And long story short is whale poop makes great fertilizer. We think there's a lot more work to be done on that front. But in any case, the early indications are that whale poop makes great fertilizer. And I think when talking with people about this, of course, they're interested or surprised, what have you. But then I have to remind folks is that almost every bit of fertilizer humanity ever used until about 70 years ago was animal poop, really. And so it shouldn't be that surprising, actually. And so talking with Victor and thinking about this problem more holistically, we came up with this idea of personifying whales as farmers, as a way to tell this story to folks like through this magazine article, which was a fun one to write. And thinking more about it, it's that the whales were really farming the phytoplankton. And again, was it conscious? Were they consciously doing this? No, they were just living their lives. But as a result of living their lives, we think that led to more productive waters in terms of the phytoplankton, which fed the krill. And the krill is what the whales eat. So maybe the better analogy would be ranchers. Whales are ranchers rather than but I just think whales as ranchers doesn't sound as good as whales as farmers. But maybe, yeah. Anyway, that's the story of that title. But the Southern Ocean, again, as spectacular as it is thirsty for nutrients, I guess you might say, or it is really starved for certain nutrients that other oceans have a lot of. And one example of that is iron. Iron is trace metal. It's a micronutrient, which means that all living things need iron or most living things. I wouldn't want to say all, because I'm sure there's some exception of some deep sea microbe or something. But almost all the animals and plants that you can think of need iron in really small quantities to survive. And there is a law, it's called Liebig's Law of the Minimum, which means that even if you have other nutrients in vast abundance, if you don't have this tiny bit of iron, you can't grow or you can't survive. I think of sailors with scurvy. What was that? Vitamin C deficiency. And so it's that exact thing, right? I mean, you could have as much other food and things that you need, but if you don't have that vitamin C, you'll die of scurvy at sea. And it's kind of it's similar type idea. So the Southern Ocean is like that, but with iron. And why is that? Well, because iron comes from land, comes from terrestrial sources. So, for example, in the North Atlantic, the ocean that separates us all here on this podcast, the North Atlantic gets most of its iron from dust blown off the Sahara Desert. Whereas the Southern Ocean, most of the land is frozen. There's not rivers that flow into the Southern Ocean to provide silt. The upwelling works a little differently there, and so that's not as good of a source of iron, though it is to some degree. The best source of iron in the Southern Ocean is melting ice. When ice melts seasonally, and then there's blooms of productivity around that melting ice. But so what we think the whales did, and that still happens, but now without the whales, what happens is that productivity sort of peaks really quickly and sinks out of the water column. What the whales did, what we believe the whales did, was keep that productivity recycling up in the upper water column. And so that productivity just continued and continued and continued. Whereas now you have this initial spring burst of productivity, and then phytoplankton bloom and krill come and eat the phytoplankton and whales come and eat the krill, but then it just sinks out really quickly because there aren't those populations of great ocean farmers to move those nutrients around the system. And that's what we think was going on. And again, this might be kind of surprising for some folks, but again, in terrestrial systems, this would be it'd be a cool thing, but it's not unusual. This is what happened to the African savanna and the Great Plains in America. And so, this is not an uncommon thing. It just might be uncommon to think about it in the open ocean.
I wonder if you could just sort of quote a couple of these numbers to us, because I think they're worth taking away. Things like whales harvested from the Southern Ocean weigh twice as much as all the wild animals. Is that
wild mammals?
Wild mammals on Earth today.
Yeah.
And sorry, I just quoted that one myself. But there's another one about how much krill there is now compared to how much krill there was when the whales were eating, when there were many, many more whales. Do you have that number to hand?
Yeah. I mean, again, I want to stress that these are all best guesses. Obviously, we don't have the exact number, and even our best guess, there's a lot of uncertainty around that. But I think as a scientist, that uncertainty is kind of exciting, right? Because future work, whether it be ours or someone else's, who knows, will better hone in on what we believe the right answer to be. And so anyway, just wanted to have that disclaimer. But yeah, so again, whaling was a truly spectacular, modern whaling, industrial whaling of the 19th and primarily 20th centuries. It was really a spectacular destruction removal of biomass from the Earth system. And as you mentioned, one of my favorite sort of quotes about that is, to put this into context, is that the removal of baleen whales in the 20th century from the oceans, and again, almost exclusively from the Southern Ocean in terms of biomass, is equivalent to the biomass, more than twice the biomass of all wild mammals on the planet today. So of course, it doesn't include us, doesn't include cattle, but you know what I'm saying? Like all wild mammals, every squirrel, every elephant, every whatever. So there's that. The other way that I like to put this into context is, when I say we killed between 1.5 and 2 million whales in the Southern Ocean, big whales in the Southern Ocean, it sounds like a lot and it's bad, obviously, but because there's billions of people, you're like, oh, well, 1 million whales, maybe that's not so bad. But so I like to translate that into people units, person units. And so if you translate that approximate amount of whales removed from the Southern Ocean between 1905 and 1975 into person mass, it's about the weight of 3 billion people, billion with a B. Again, with plus or minus some error, but that's the range that we're in. And so imagine now in one human lifespan, 70 years, you wipe out about half the people, a little less than half, 40% of the people on the planet are just gone. That's what this is like. And it really is just astonishing, I think, when you put it in those types of terms.
Absolutely. And can you kind of draw back a bit more and say what are the kind of impacts on the Earth system?
Yeah. So you want to talk about the krill, right? And what we know about the krill. So I think so some of the research that we did recently, we published a paper on this last year, is that even if you use conservative metrics of feeding, which is to say our numbers for how much whales eat in a given day were higher than other past estimates, but even if you use the past estimates that we think are a little low, maybe our numbers are a little high, these are scientific details that for the point I'm going to make don't really matter. Because no matter what estimates you use of how much food whales ate or whales eat, if you then simply extrapolate back to how many whales we are fairly certain there were, based on how many we killed and so on, there had to be far more krill in the Southern Ocean, and particularly in the Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean, than there are today. It's just really simple math. For example, we estimate that in this Atlantic sector of the Southern Ocean, blue and fin whales, just those two species, required about 100 million metric tons of krill each year. That's what they ate each year. In that sector today, there's somewhere between 60 and 70 million metric tons. So I think we just need to be realistic about if we want to recover whales, what impedes that recovery, that ultimate recovery? What baselines are we trying to get back to? Because if we're trying to get back to pre-whaling baselines of populations of, for example, blue and fin whales, there just simply isn't enough food. It's just that simple. And it's not like you have to do some fancy math to figure it out. It's like the whales needed 100 million tons. There's 65, give or take. That's not going to work out. And more to this point, it's not like, oh, okay, well, maybe we can get the krill up to 100 million metric tons and then the whales can recover. Well, think about how ecosystems work, right? You can't, as a whale or as a population of whales, eat every bit of krill because then there wouldn't be krill for the next year. So typically it's estimated that Antarctic predators might remove somewhere between a fifth to a third of the total Antarctic krill production in a given area in a given year. So if blue and fin whales were eating 100 million metric tons in this region, then that means that there was something like 500 million metric tons of krill in this region. And right now there's about 60. So we're looking at a potential for like a 10-fold reduction. Mm-hmm. And again, there's a lot of wiggle room and a lot of, uncertainty around this, but that's the sort of, I just want to put it on the scale that we're talking about. I want to put it on the relative range we're talking about. We need, if we want to recover the whales to the levels that they were, we need not 50% more krill, not twice as much krill. We need 10 times more krill. Mm-hmm. So that's a very big difference.
And you talk a lot, Matthew, about these numbers being estimates. But I know that one of the reasons that you work with Conor is because of some of the observations that he's made in the field. And I'm just wondering if maybe you could talk about the importance of those observations and maybe a little bit about how the two of you came to work together, because that's also, I know, an interesting story.
Yeah. I mean, it's the wonders of the internet in the modern age, right? So Conor is, among other things, a really spectacular photographer. I encourage anyone who's interested in pelagic ocean photography, or really just nature photography, to go and check out Conor's work. But in any case, I'm one of his fervent supporters of his photography, and I follow him on Twitter. And he was in the Southern Ocean doing trips for Lindblad and Nat Geo, and he posted some absolutely spectacular videos and images of these enormous feeding groups of whales that they'd run into. And I'd love to hear from Conor what that experience was like, because I actually haven't heard in his spoken word about that. Because that, I think what's most spectacular about that, what really caught my eye about those things that he saw recently, and I've never seen anything like this personally, is that that's what we expected the Southern Ocean to be like 100 years ago. He was able to take a time machine, and the people on that boat were able to take a time machine back to 1920, 1880, whatever it is, and actually experience one of these enormous, enormous groups of whales and other krill predators in the Southern Ocean, something that very few people on Earth have seen today. And now it's seen as an exceptional sighting, and it really is an exceptional sighting. We think it might be the largest ever congregation of baleen whales, like ever recorded. That's not to say that they weren't ever this many whales recorded, but it was, again, probably around 1900, and they weren't taking careful measurements of how many whales were around. They were focused on killing them. So in any case, I'd love to hear from Conor on his really exceptional sighting and what got us connected, and what the Southern Ocean might have looked like 100 years ago.
Conor, are you there?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, my connection is coming and going, but just to back up what Matt has said there, it was beyond belief, really, what we were witnessing. I had a stress headache after witnessing it, because I just could not comprehend what I was seeing. We were trying to document as best we could what we were observing. We had incredible weather conditions, and that was one of the key things in our favor. We were in a place that's normally very rough off the South Orkney Islands, and it was like a picket fence on the horizon. Everywhere you looked, there were just white lines, which of course were the whales' blows, their vapor plumes, and super cold air. They last in the air for a while, and we kind of drifted in towards them in the ship, and the captain was laughing because at one point we couldn't leave the area. There were so many whales, we just could not get out of them. And they were very active in feeding. And it was these old accounts. They say you could walk across the whales' backs. There were moments where you could literally have jumped from whale to whale for a few hundred meters. Just astonishing. And kind of back to what I said and what Matt mentioned as well about the kind of feeling of time travel. It definitely brought us back to a time that we thought perhaps we might never witness again, whales in this abundance. It was sharply tempered by something else we saw at the same time, which is the krill fishing vessels quite close to the whales. And subsequently we learned that one of those very vessels had caught 3 whales that year. Not the same species we were looking at, but just shows you the problem that of fishing so close to whales is that they don't know to avoid the nets. And these krill fishing vessels are fishing for quite long periods. The nets may stay in the water for 10 or 20 days sometimes, because it's a continuous cycle. So that kind of elevates the threat to whales when they're in high density. So this was all happening in the exact same location as where the whales were. This industrial scale commercial krill fishery in the Southern Ocean whale sanctuary, all certified sustainable and all that, but still absolutely shocking to see. So we had this amazing sense of, perhaps we're seeing whales recovering here, but immediately brought back to reality by the fact that we are still extracting resources on an industrial scale in this part of the planet.
Real, like you say, real paradox there between the kind of really hopeful notion of seeing this amazing sort of throwback, and then, like you say, the reality of what's still going on. I know one of the things that, Matthew, you talked about in your article on how we might bring back more whales, how we might increase the number of krill in order to be able to increase the number of whales. And you talked about the idea of being able to fertilize some of these previous whaling grounds with iron, as you talked about. Is that something that's potentially going to happen? Is that something that is realistic, or are there other ways that we might be able to see some hope in this?
Yeah, I think the way I like to think of this recovery strategy, and I think probably this is true for other ecosystems as well, is there are less risky things that are also potentially, like, they'll give you more predictable results, but also they might not recover your system in the way that you want. And then there's the next tier of recovery strategies, restoration strategies that are more risky, but also potentially with more reward as well. But as the saying goes, with more implicit risks. And so, yeah, so we've been discussing, I mean, now, and again, I think I want to again stress these are early discussions. There's nothing planned at this time, and it might never happen because it's an extremely complicated venture to even think about. But we were thinking about what an experiment would look like, because you wouldn't just, that's another thing that I think is maybe perhaps taken and run with in the wrong way that I want to avoid, is it's not just that all of a sudden we'd start fertilizing the whaling grounds. No, there'd be experiments in very controlled small areas of the whaling grounds, really small areas, to see. And actually any experiments done with iron fertilization would not really to actually be to see what happens with the whales, but would be to see what happens with the krill. That would be the real, because that's really that's the linchpin of this whole system, right? And so we want to see how krill respond to basically mimicking whale fertilization behavior, and if we can recover krill that way. So one of the ways I like to think about this ecosystem is like a car with a dead battery, in that all the components are there. The car could still work in theory, but what it might need is a jump start. And that's the way I would think of these potential iron fertilization experiments, and then potentially procedure. But again, there's no formulated plan or timeline or anything like that. We're just sort of kicking around these ideas at a very, very early stage. And I think, a much more palatable and therefore perhaps tractable solution before then is to increase protections in areas that we know are critically important for recovering whales, such as the area where Ryan saw, Conor, I keep on calling him, get two first names, it's confusing for me. Conor Ryan saw this incredible aggregation of fin whales and krill fishing vessels as well. That area is about 100 or 200 kilometers from a no-take marine protected area. And as we see around the world with no-take marine protected areas, fishing vessels do their best to skirt these regulations, and they line up right outside the no-take MPA. And it seems like that's also what's happening in the Southern Ocean. And, I just think we need to be really, really careful as to how we tinker with this system and why we're doing it. We need to be really introspective as a species, as a human species, as to why we're doing it, right? And again, because it's everything that we do, whether it's a personal decision or a global civilization decision, it's got to be a risk reward or a cost benefit analysis. And, is the reward of getting some krill from the Southern Ocean worth the risk of further perturbing the system that's already been, so substantially degraded? I personally would answer no, but of course I would say that I'm a marine conservation biologist. I'm not, I don't work for the fishing industry in any way. So I think we need to have these conversations, but I think that the fishing industry needs to come to the table with like the ability to really negotiate or meet us halfway, because ultimately we're all hoping for the same thing, which is a bountiful ocean, which is a biodiverse and bio-rich ocean. And that will benefit fisheries, ultimately. It might not benefit fisheries next year if we increase a no-take MPA zone, but 100 years from now, it would help fisheries. That's the goal. Although it's hard for people to think on those timescales when their paycheck is due, or their bills are due next month, and that's when they need their money. It's like, okay, well, so what if there might be more krill 100 years from now? I don't care about that, and I get those concerns. I do understand those concerns. And I think there are political and economic levers that we can do to ameliorate concerns like that. And I think that's why governments, industry, and science really need to think carefully and work together about, well, this is one issue, but many issues facing the planet as to how we tinker with Mother Nature in this era of degraded, the degraded planet system. Yeah, and just very briefly, this gets back to the initial question that you asked, which was, what's the deal with iron fertilization? Are we seriously considering it, or so on? Think about it like a loop or a line, and I'd contrast those two things. So whales or animals within an ecosystem, they're all acting in a loop, right? So animals live and poop and breed and die and decompose and so on. And so they're all within that system, right? They're using and recycling nutrients throughout that system. It's a loop. Whereas humans, when humans deal with systems, particularly ocean systems, where we are just guests, we are just visitors to ocean systems as opposed to terrestrial systems where we live. When we visit and extract resources from ocean systems, it is a one-way line. It's a one-way street of resources out of the ocean without anything returned to the ocean. And that is not ultimately a sustainable practice, particularly if you do it at the scale and pace at which humans like to do things, modern humans. And so we need to think about, if we're going to keep doing this fishing, how can we close that loop? How can we better protect this system so that we do get these positive feedback loops in ocean productivity that, frankly, we all want? Conor and I want, the fishing industry does want, and the whales want. So this is, I hope that we can reframe this issue in something of a co-equal goal. We all want this same thing. How do we get there? Now we can discuss the details of how we get there. And I don't think the way we get there is to have industrial krill extraction in the midst of a foraging mega aggregation of whales. I don't think that's a sustainable practice ultimately.
I wanted to ask you both briefly, if I could, where next in your careers? If we just sort of ask very briefly, what's going to happen next for you both, Matthew and Conor?
Oh man, you asked a tough question. I feel like I'm in an interview. Woo! No, just kidding. Yeah, I would like to keep studying these types of issues. I mean, I think it's really important to shed light on what's going on in our ocean, particularly in the far reaches of our ocean. So a lot of the ocean is inaccessible to folks, right? Even the coasts, which we're lucky enough to live on or near, all of us on this call, we're extremely privileged to have that opportunity. And there are so many people on the planet that might never, ever even see the ocean, let alone experience the ocean, let alone see ocean life or even a whale. And so one of my personal goals is to use science to tell stories about the ocean that inspire ocean conservation, even for folks that aren't lucky enough to experience the ocean themselves or experience it as much as they would like. And because I was recently, I was in a seminar by a fairly famous writer here in the States, Ian Urbina. He recently wrote a really fantastic book called Outlaw Ocean, which I encourage you all to give a read to. But one of the things Ian said was that people, just the general public, respond more to their hearts than to their heads. So in other words, the way I take that to mean is, if you can tell a compelling story that makes someone stop and say, wow, or oh my God, we need to do something about that, that's going to be more motivating, I think, ultimately, than saying, we killed 500 whales this year and we should be killing 260 whales instead if we want to, blah, 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 right? That was a perhaps bad example, but the point here is that people respond to stories and narratives better than data, which is a little sad for me as a scientist, but I get it. I totally get it. That's why we all like to read stories, whether it's investigative journalism or novels or things like that, because it's more interesting to read a profoundly powerful investigative report on, whatever the issue at hand might be, than just reading a couple bullet point facts. Mm-hmm. And I think ultimately we're going to have people, the global population, respond to a combination of stories. I think it needs to be told in stories, but bolstered by evidence, bolstered by facts.
Thank you, Matthew. That's brilliant. And I think your You're obviously achieving your goal when you're sort of writing articles like the one you did for us in the Marine Biologist magazine, and the way you speak so passionately and engagingly. So thank you.
I feel very fortunate that I get to spend, months on end out at sea. But it's interesting you mentioned storytelling, because essentially that's kind of what I've become. The job I'm in at the moment, we take people to and we, show them this is what looks pristine, and this is what we have to lose potentially if we don't pay attention to the signs that nature is giving us that things are going awry. I just want to keep doing that. And I'm a big believer in the old school natural history. Go out there with a notebook and a pen and just document what we've seen. We've got amazing technology in science these days, and amazing interdisciplinary work. And sometimes that can distract from the real basic stuff. Just go out there and observe and document. And I love that. And I want to continue to do that as a naturalist.
That's great. And very quickly, do you have any advice for anyone who's looking for a career in marine biology, either of you?
Conor, you want to go?
I would say, as a kid growing up, I was always encouraged to use the sea and to spend time at home, like kayaking and using small boats and tinkering with engines and, stealing petrol out of my father's lawnmower to put it in his boat engine so I could go out and fish for mackerel. And I always thought that was just mucking around. But in the end, those are all skills that stood to me as a zoology graduate. I had water confidence. I could swim, which gave me confidence on the sea. I knew how to tie knots. I knew how to trouble start engines and things like that. I didn't have certificates for all that sort of stuff, but it gave me the confidence to go out and do my own field work in West Africa, for example, where we had no Coast Guard or rescue services. We were very much operating alone in rough seas. And it allows you to kind of push out the boundaries in your research if you're comfortable in that environment. So think about things like kayaking or surfing as skills that will all be in your toolkit as a marine scientist.
Yeah, I want to take that question and kind of go the opposite way with it. And I want to talk to the kids or to the young people that, as we mentioned before, might never have seen the ocean or have any access to the ocean. But I'm also here to say that you could be a kid in Iowa or in Central Asia or wherever. And, if you have a passion for the ocean, for protecting the ocean and the function that the ocean has on planetary health, or you're just fascinated by ocean life or whatever the case may be, see if you can go visit an aquarium, see if you can access some interesting resources on the internet. That's why I wrote a story like this, because I think someone who's interested in this type of work can just read about this and become hopefully interested and curious. And ultimately, that's what moves not just marine science forward, but the world forward, is to ask questions and to not be satisfied with the answers, right? To ask those questions, find out what we know. And in the process of asking those questions and finding out what we know, we discover what we don't know. And I think that to me has been most interesting. It's just like, wow, we don't know that? That's weird. Can we know that? Is there a way to get a better answer for that? Who do I need to talk to put the pieces together to get a better answer for that question that I have? And so if your questions, and the questions can be in any realm, but if your questions boil down to something about ocean functioning or marine life, you don't need to be near the ocean. You don't need to have certificates, as Conor said, or, to be a scuba diver or a whatever. You don't need to be a boat captain or whatever it is. I know marine biologists who get violently seasick and therefore never go out to sea. Actually, I'm thinking of a couple of people. And then I also know marine biologists who get seasick and go out to sea anyway. So right or wrong way to be a marine biologist. And I think that is what I'd like young people to take away. And so if you're interested in this type of work, great. Follow that passion, follow that interest. That's what we need. We need smart, passionate, enthusiastic people working on ocean issues, whether or not you're able to access the ocean.
I think your point about the fact there is no right or wrong way is exactly what all young people need to hear. Just do it your way. And so as we finish up, can I just ask if people are interested in contacting you both, or one or other of you, where can they find you? How do they get in contact? How do they continue this conversation?
Yeah, so I mean, my name is Matthew Savoca, MATTHEWSAVOCA. And just by typing that into Google, I've done enough media stuff now that you'll find me. So, and I could read out my Twitter handle. It's DJ Shearwater, which is a type of ocean bird.
Yeah, I'm on Twitter as well. It's probably the best way to get me on Twitter. And a dear friend of mine once gave me the nickname Whale Nerd, and that's my Twitter handle. So whale_nerd. And I've got a website as well, which you can email me through the website, and it's conorryan.photography. So yeah, if you have any questions or looking for any tips or just to chat, just get in touch with me in either of those.
So once again, I'd just like to round up. Thank you so much, Matthew. Conor, it's been absolutely brilliant, and I hope we can work with you again in the future.
That sounds great. That'd be a lot of fun. It was a great process for me, and I got to know Conor through it, and it's been a win-win all around for me.
Brilliant.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you both. Thank you both very much.
Matthew's article with some of Conor's spectacular images is freely available to read on the Marine Biologist magazine website, which you can find at www.mba.ac.uk/marine-biologist. And if you'd like to receive 4 editions of the magazine a year, go to the membership tab on our website and join the Marine Biological Association.
Thank you very much for listening. This has been the Marine Biologist podcast. If you've enjoyed this episode, then please check out our other episodes. Please subscribe to our podcast. Please rate it, share it with your friends and family, and let us know what you think. And we will look forward to welcoming you to the next episode soon. Take care.